I want you guys to remember the last time you've been to a lecture. Now, I want you to tell me exactly what you learned in that lecture. Ready? If you couldn't find anything, well then it is time for you to stop going to lectures. The biggest misconception I see students making is thinking, well, if I go to every single lecture, and I also spend 10 hours every week studying for the class, then I'm guaranteed to be successful in my class, right? Hate to break it to you, that's not how it works. And before I start this video, I want to say that I'm not a genius, I'm not special, I'm not gifted. I used to be a B- student. One of the biggest reasons of how I was able to go from a B- student to a 4.0 GPA student in graduate school and working at Meta is because I now have this new perspective of what work is that I'm going to share with you guys in this video. First things first, the amount of time that you spend and the amount of effort that you put in to try and go to every lecture, that on its own does not matter at all. If you go to a 2-hour lecture and you can't tell me exactly what you learned in those 2 hours, well then in my opinion, you just wasted 2 hours of your entire life. And this brings me to my first point, which is to focus on the output, not the input. Your output here is you want to understand the topics and you want to be a good student, not you want to go to every lecture. Notice there's a difference in focusing on the input, which is going to lecture, and focusing on understanding what the class is about, which is the output. And while going to lecture will sometimes result in understanding the concepts better, this is not always the case. Let's say I have two options. I can either go to lecture for 2 hours, or I can read the textbook on my own, and both result in me understanding the same thing. Well, if I can read the textbook, the whole entire chapter in 30 minutes, let's say, well then, I have just worked 4 times as hard as going to lecture if I spent 2 hours reading the textbook compared to going to lecture for 2 hours. Do you see the difference? And let me give you a real world example. So back in high school, I had this physics professor, and now he's a chill guy, but he was absolutely dog at teaching. Sometimes what I would do in that class is that I would sit in the back of the class and I will watch Khan Academy videos on the topic that he is trying to lecture instead of actually watching his lecture. And while the entire class was confused on the lecture, I was understanding it perfectly because I found someone online who was explaining it way better than he did. And I remember a few days later there was a quiz. We all took the quiz and I got one of the highest scores in the class because I watched Khan Academy instead of watching his class. And this is the biggest difference I have observed between decent students and the very best students. Decent students just spam their input as hard as they can and try and get as much output. But the very best students know how to utilize their leverage. They know what to do to maximize their output per unit time of input. They can then figure out the best strategy for maximizing their output and spam their input that gives them the most output. And just to be clear, this video was made not to discourage people from going to lecture. Rather, this video is intended for you to think about how you are doing work. Instead of going to lecture blindly, consider, is going to lecture making the most use of your time? And if it isn't, well, maybe you should do something else instead of going to lecture.